If you walk into a coffee shop today, you will see a tableau that has become the favorite punching bag of cable news pundits and Thanksgiving dinner table debates. You see a 20-something, perhaps staring at a laptop or scrolling through a phone, sipping a $7 oat milk latte. To one generation, this image is proof of moral decay, a sign of a youth obsessed with instant gratification, unable to save and unwilling to sacrifice. To the other generation, that latte is the only luxury they can afford in a world where the traditional milestones of adulthood have been incinerated by market forces entirely out of their control. This is not a disagreement about work ethic. It is a fundamental divergence in reality. We are witnessing an economic Cold War, a silent decoupling of shared experience where two distinct demographic groups are living in the same country but inhabiting two completely different economies. To understand the scale of this war, we have to strip away the culture war aesthetics, the headlines about quiet quitting or okay boomer, and look at the raw, unadulterated mathematics of survival. The numbers do not care about your feelings, and right now, the numbers are screaming that the social contract has been breached. Let's go back to 1980. The median home price in the United States was roughly $47,000. The median household income was about $21,000. The math is simple. A house cost roughly 2.5 times the annual salary of a typical worker. It was a tangible, achievable goal. You could work at a grocery store or a factory, save for 3 years, and buy a piece of the American dream. A mortgage was a manageable burden, not a life sentence. Fast forward to 2024. The median home price has skyrocketed past $420,000, while the median household income has limped along to around $75,000. The ratio has exploded. A house now costs nearly 6, 7, or in some coastal cities, 10 times the average annual salary. The ladder to the middle class hasn't just been pulled up. It has been shattered and used for firewood. When a baby boomer tells a member of Gen Z to just save money, they are operating on outdated firmware. They are giving advice for a video game that no longer exists. Saving 10% of your income in 1980 meant you were buying a house in 5 years. Saving 10% of your income today means you might have a down payment by the time you are 50, provided inflation doesn't eat the value of that cash first. This is the silent depression that young people feel in their bones, but struggle to articulate against the gaslighting of economic indicators like GDP or the stock market. We are told the economy is strong because the line on the graph is going up. But who owns the assets represented by that line? The disconnect is violent. We have created a bifurcated economy where asset owners, primarily older generations, see their net worth balloon with every tick of the S&P 500, while wage earners, primarily younger generations, see the purchasing power of their paycheck dissolve in real time. Consider the cost of entry into the professional world. In 1980, the average annual tuition at a 4-year public university was roughly $2,300 adjusted for inflation. A student could work a summer job, maybe flip burgers or paint fences, and pay for their entire year of education. They graduated with a degree and zero debt, starting the race at the starting line. Today, that same education costs upwards of $25,000 a year or more. The summer job doesn't cover tuition. It barely covers textbooks and transportation. Gen Z graduates are entering the workforce not at the starting line, but 50 yards behind it, shackled to a ball and chain of student loans that average $30,000 to $100,000. They are servicing debt for an education that is increasingly required for entry-level jobs that pay less, in real terms, than what their parents made without a degree. This structural disadvantage creates a phenomenon known as doom spending. Critics look at a young person buying a designer bag or an expensive dinner and scream, irresponsibility. But look closer. If the mathematical probability of owning a home, retiring comfortably, or building generational wealth drops to near zero, the rational economic actor stops saving for a future that won't happen. If you cannot save $100,000 for a down payment because rent consumes 60% of your income, that extra $200 in your pocket isn't savings, it's coping money. It is the price of a small dopamine hit to distract from the existential dread of a futureless horizon. It is not financial illiteracy. It is a nihilistic adaptation to a broken system. The boomer generation, born into the post-war economic anomaly, rode the greatest wave of wealth expansion in human history. They benefited from cheap energy, affordable housing, strong unions, and a government that heavily subsidized their education and suburban expansion. They didn't just work hard, they worked hard in an environment designed to reward that work with exponential growth. They bought homes for pennies on the dollar of current value, watched those assets appreciate by 1,000%, and now sit on a hoard of wealth estimated at over $78 trillion. Meanwhile, millennials and Gen Z hold a fraction of that, despite being the most educated and productive workforce in history. Productivity is perhaps the most damning statistic of all. Since 1979, worker productivity has grown by roughly 60%, while hourly pay has grown by less than 15%. Young workers are generating more value working faster, using more complex tools, and producing more profit than any generation before them. Yet they are capturing almost none of that value. The surplus value, the fruit of their labor, is being siphoned upward, converted into stock buybacks, executive bonuses, and dividends that flow primarily into the portfolios of the older generation. This is not just envy. It is a structural strangulation. When we talk about inflation, we often treat it like a natural weather event, something that just happens. But for Gen Z, inflation is personal. It is the realization that the grocery bill has doubled in 4 years, while the entry-level salary has stagnated. It is the reality that rent in a major city now demands an income of 6 figures just to live with roommates. The poverty line is an outdated metric. The dignity line, the income required to live alone, save for retirement, and eat healthy food, has moved so far out of reach that it feels like a hallucination. The psychological toll of this economic war is the defining characteristic of the modern youth culture. It explains the dark humor, the skepticism of institutions, and the refusal to climb the corporate ladder. Why climb a ladder that is burning? Why show loyalty to a company that views you as a line item to be cut to preserve the quarterly dividend? The social contract, the deal that said if you work hard, play by the rules, and get an education, you will have a better life than your parents, has been voided. And the generation that voided it is currently busy lecturing the victims about the price of coffee. But to stop the analysis here would be to wallow in victimhood without understanding the mechanics of the crime. This was not an accident. The immense wealth gap between the old and the young was not a random fluctuation of the free market. It was engineered. It was the result of specific policy choices, tax code revisions, and corporate strategies implemented over the last 4 decades. To understand why Gen Z is broke, we have to look at the engine room of the economy. We have to look at the moment the rules were changed. That moment can be traced with forensic precision to the early 1980s, specifically to a shift in corporate philosophy that transformed the American economy from a mechanism of shared prosperity into an engine of wealth extraction. Before this pivot, the prevailing economic doctrine held that a corporation had a responsibility to multiple stakeholders: its customers, its employees, the community, and its shareholders. Wages largely tracked with productivity. As companies got more efficient and profitable, workers got paid more. But then came the adoption of the Friedman Doctrine, the idea that the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. This wasn't just a change in mood. It was codified into law and regulation. Consider the obscurity of SEC Rule 10b-18. Before 1982, it was illegal for corporations to manipulate their own stock prices by buying back their own shares. It was considered market manipulation. In 1982, the rules were relaxed, opening the floodgates for stock buybacks. This seemingly boring regulatory tweak is the smoking gun of the generational heist. Instead of taking profits and reinvesting them into research and development, or heaven forbid, raising employee wages, companies began pouring trillions of dollars into buying their own stock. This artificially inflated share prices, triggering massive bonuses for executives paid in stock options and enriching shareholders, who were overwhelmingly older Americans. The money that used to go into the paychecks of the working class was diverted into the portfolios of the asset class. This financialization of the economy meant that the prosperity of the nation was no longer measured by the health of the middle class, but by the performance of the asset markets. And the most critical asset in this war is housing. The housing crisis facing Gen Z is not a failure of the market. It is the success of a cartel. Over the last 40 years, local governments, dominated by older homeowners, have weaponized zoning laws to artificially restrict the supply of new housing. This is the NIMBY, not in my backyard phenomenon, but viewing it as mere neighborhood protectionism is naive. It is a protection racket for asset values. By blocking high-density housing, affordable apartments, and new developments, existing homeowners ensured that the scarcity of shelter would drive the value of their homes into the stratosphere. Housing was transformed from a utility, a place to live, into a leveraged investment vehicle that must appreciate faster than inflation to fund the retirement of the baby boomer generation. This creates a mathematical impossibility for Gen Z. For boomers to retire comfortably on their home equity, housing must remain unaffordable for their children. The system cannot serve two masters. It chose the incumbents. When you hear local councils blocking a new apartment complex to preserve neighborhood character, translate that to preserving asset scarcity. The result is a neo-feudalism, where the landed gentry collects rent from a permanent underclass of renters who are paying off mortgages they do not own. Furthermore, the very concept of credit was weaponized. The FICO score, which determines your ability to rent an apartment, buy a car, or even get a job, didn't exist in its current form until 1989. It was introduced just as the older generation had already secured their assets. We built a surveillance system for financial obedience that demands you have a history of debt to be considered trustworthy. For a young person starting out with stagnant wages and high living costs, one missed payment, one medical emergency, or one breakdown of a used car can tank this score, locking them out of the financial system for years. It is a digital caste system that penalizes poverty and rewards leverage, but only if you have the capital to access that leverage in the first place. Then there is the mechanism of debt itself, specifically student loans. The narrative sold to millennials and Gen Z was that education was the key to escaping this trap. But the government, by guaranteeing student loans without regulating tuition costs, handed universities a blank check. Colleges realized that if the government would lend a teenager any amount of money to attend, they could raise prices indefinitely. The cost of administration bloated, campuses turned into resorts to attract customers, and the quality of education didn't necessarily improve. We created a unique financial product, student debt, that is uniquely predatory. Unlike a business loan or a credit card, it is nearly impossible to discharge in bankruptcy. We stripped young people of the one consumer protection that exists for gamblers and failed business tycoons. A failed casino owner can declare bankruptcy and start over. A 22-year-old with a history degree cannot. This brings us to the most insidious mechanism of all, quantitative easing and the response to the 2008 financial crisis. When the housing bubble created by the financial deregulation mentioned earlier burst, the government didn't bail out the homeowners. It bailout out the banks. The Federal Reserve printed trillions of dollars to stabilize the financial system. This is known as the Cantillon effect. When new money is printed, it doesn't appear magically in everyone's pockets simultaneously. It enters the economy through the financial sector. The banks and corporations get the money first, at near zero interest rates. They use it to buy assets, stocks, bonds, real estate. By the time that money trickles down to the wage earner, it has already inflated the price of everything. The older generation who owned the assets saw their net worth recover and double. The younger generation who earned wages saw only the inflation that resulted. We devalued the currency to save the asset prices of the wealthy. Even the tax code was re-engineered to facilitate this transfer. We tax labor, the primary income source of the young, at a much higher rate than we tax capital gains, the primary income source of the old. If you work for a living, you pay income tax, payroll tax, Medicare tax, and Social Security tax. If you simply own things and sell them for a profit, you pay a significantly lower capital gains rate. We have built a fiscal structure that punishes effort and rewards ownership. This is not accidental. It is the result of a lobbying feedback loop. The generation with the wealth hires the lobbyists to write the tax laws that preserve that wealth, ensuring that the burden of funding the state falls increasingly on the shoulders of those with the least ability to pay. The ultimate defense of this system is the promise of the great wealth transfer, the idea that eventually boomers will die and pass this $78 trillion down to millennials and Gen Z. This is the carrot dangled in front of the donkey. But the data suggests this is a fantasy for the majority. First, people are living longer and the cost of end-of-life care has exploded. The healthcare industry is poised to vacuum up a massive percentage of that wealth before it ever reaches the next generation. Assisted living facilities, expensive pharmaceuticals, and chronic care management are the final mechanism of extraction. The family home isn't going to the children. It's being liquidated to pay for 10 years of nursing home care. Second, wealth is highly concentrated. The transfer will happen, but it will be dynastic. The children of the top 10% will inherit millions, effectively creating a permanent aristocracy, while the children of the bottom 90% inherit nothing but the national debt. This is the machinery of the economic war. It is not a conspiracy of evil men in a dark room. It is a conspiracy of incentives, a complex clockwork of policy decisions, regulatory captures, and financial engineering designed to pump value upward and insulate the incumbents from the consequences of their own greed. The system is working exactly as it was designed. It was designed to consume the future to subsidize the present. But systems that rely on infinite extraction eventually run out of fuel. And the fuel for this machine was the hope and compliance of the youth. That tank is now empty. The engine is sputtering, and the check engine light has been smashed with a hammer. When the social contract is broken, when the tank of hope runs dry, the inevitable result is not necessarily a violent revolution in the streets, but a quiet mass withdrawal from the game itself. We are already seeing the early tremors of this seismic shift in behavior. The media brands it with catchy, dismissive labels like quiet quitting, lying flat, or the soft life, framing it as a crisis of work ethic. But a sociologist looks at this and sees a rational market correction. If the reward for grinding 60 hours a week is no longer a house and a secure future, but merely survival in a rented box, then the rational actor minimizes their input to match the output. It is an algorithmic response. If the system pays minimum viable wages, it receives minimum viable effort. This is the first phase of the future, the great opt-out. We are moving toward a period of economic asymmetry, where the younger generation simply refuses to participate in the consumption cycle that powers the boomer economy. If Gen Z cannot afford to buy the products that drive the stock market, corporate earnings will compress. If they cannot afford to buy the McMansions in the suburbs, the real estate market will face a liquidity crisis of biblical proportions. The boomers are currently sitting on millions of large, single-family homes that are ill-suited for the elderly. They are counting on selling these homes to fund their nursing care. But who is the buyer? A generation with no savings and a credit score destroyed by student loans. The great wealth transfer might actually manifest as the great asset deflation, where the value of these hoarded assets collapses simply because there is no one on the other side of the trade. This leads us to the demographic cliff, the most ruthless solver of economic equations. The silent depression has birthed a silent strike on the production of the next generation. The birth rate in developed economies has collapsed below replacement levels. This is not just a lifestyle choice. It is an economic vote of no confidence. Children are the ultimate long-term investment, signaling faith in the future. By refusing to reproduce, young people are signaling that they do not believe the current system is viable for human flourishing. This creates a terrifying feedback loop for the existing order. Social Security and Medicare are Ponzi schemes that require an ever-expanding base of young workers to pay for the top-heavy cap of retirees. We are in the process of inverting the pyramid. As the boomer generation ages into their most expensive years, the tax base required to support them is shrinking. So what is the solution? If we look for a savior in Washington or a sudden reversal of 40 years of monetary policy, we will be waiting in vain. The political system is geriatric and entrenched, designed to protect the status quo until the bitter end. The solution, therefore, is individual and community-level adaptation. It is a shift toward a wartime economy mindset for the youth. This means abandoning the scripts of success written in the 20th century. The dream of the white picket fence and the 30-year corporate gold watch is dead. Mourning it only wastes time. The new survival strategy is agility and decentralization. We are seeing the rise of a parallel economy. If the housing market is rigged, we see the explosion of van life, tiny homes, and multi-generational co-living not as tragic failures, but as strategic maneuvers to lower the burn rate. By violently slashing their cost of living, young people are regaining the one asset the system tries to steal: time. If you don't need $4,000 a month for a mortgage, you don't need to submit to the corporate grinder. This is the Stoic adaptation. It is the realization that if you cannot increase your income to match the insanity of asset prices, you must radically alter your definition of a good life to escape the trap of consumerism. It is a return to minimalism not as an aesthetic, but as a defense mechanism. Financial survival now requires an embrace of volatility. The obsession Gen Z has with cryptocurrency, meme stocks, and high-risk assets is often mocked as gambling. And often it is. But it is also a rational response to a rigged casino. When slow, steady savings guarantee a loss of purchasing power due to inflation, the only way to catch up is to take massive risks. We will likely see this bifurcate. A large portion of the generation will lose everything chasing lottery tickets, while a smaller, disciplined faction will use these new, decentralized financial rails to opt out of the fiat currency system entirely, building wealth in assets that cannot be debased by a central bank printer. Ultimately, the resolution of this war will be dictated by biology. The gerontocracy, ruled by the old, has a natural expiration date. Over the next 15 to 20 years, the boomer generation will pass. The wealth they hoarded will be released, either through inheritance, liquidation for healthcare, or taxation. The political stranglehold will loosen. The question is not if the system will change, but what state the world will be in when the keys are finally handed over. For the young, the directive is to survive the interval. This means prioritizing skills over degrees, liquidity over leverage, and community over commodities. The institutions are crumbling. Rely on your network. The economy is hostile. Build your fortress. We are living through the friction of a paradigm shift. The old world is dying and the new one is struggling to be born. It is a painful, chaotic transition. But the math always corrects itself in the end. Prices will revert to the mean, bubbles will burst, and the artificial scarcity created to protect the old will evaporate. The tragedy is that a generation had to be sacrificed to prove that an economy built on greed and infinite extraction was never sustainable in the first place. The war is real, the casualties are your bank accounts, but the occupation is temporary. History is long, and the future, by default, belongs to those who live long enough to claim it.